Good evening. I think we will now get started. So I'd like to welcome everybody who's joining us on Zoom, and I would like to welcome our distinguished speakers this evening. For anyone who does not know, I'm Diane Sayre, and I am an independent candidate for U.S. Senate in 2022. I'm running for the seat currently held by Chuckles Schumer, as I like to call him, who will not be chuckling, hopefully, much longer. Tonight, we'll be hearing from myself, briefly also the late Lyndon LaRouche by video, Senator Colonel Richard Black, who has many of you have probably seen the video that he did from the Schiller Institute conference warning of the potential of a military coup against President Trump and really against the Republic. He'll be followed by Kirk Wiebe, who is formerly of the NSA, whistleblower, part of the Thin Thread team with Bill Binney. Then Mr. James Jatras, who was an advisor to the Senate Republicans, and Daniel Burke, my colleague, who is currently an independent candidate in the state of New Jersey, who is running against Cory Booker in the 2020 elections. So we will each have some brief remarks to situate things, and then we will open up the forum for questions and comments. And I know there are some people in the Zoom channel who will be joining us who are candidates for office and things like that. So what I would like to do to start us off, to situate where we are, is to open with a very short video from Lyndon LaRouche from a webcast that he gave in 2009 when Barack Obama was president. And the title of the webcast is Britain Delenda Est.
The British have always handled us nicely by getting us into wars in places like Asia. This is the way the British run the world. The British Empire runs the world through warfare. The same way they got imperial power by inducing the silly nation states of Europe to go to war to each other in the so-called 7 Years' War. And the leading nations of Europe went to war against each other for 7 years, while the British stood on the sidelines and encouraged the process and laughed. And then on February in 1763, in a Peace of Paris, the British Empire was declared as the empire of a private company called the British East India Company. And the British East India Company took over what had become the United Kingdom, and has run it from that time to its equivalent, the present day. The British East India Company, of course, went into bankruptcy at a later period. There were changes made, as under Victoria, and so forth. But the principle remained the same, of a maritime characteristic, that it was originally based on the maritime power of the Mediterranean Sea, and later spread to the Atlantic Ocean. A maritime power which had created a control over the use of money. And the basis of this power was money, the control of money as a form of imperialism. All European imperialism, including British imperialism today, is not based on a landed territory. It's based on an international organization of the control of money. Now, this money is actually controlled by private interests, by individuals who form concerts of private interests, who set up the control of money, its creation and management. And nation states are subsidiary to this international control of money. The British Empire, which evolved out of this process, is nothing but that. It is not an empire of the people of the United Kingdom. It is an empire of an international consortium of these types of interests whose control over money is used by use of the control of money to control nations.
So when President Donald Trump was inaugurated, one of the first newspaper or media articles to come out was in the London Spectator, if you can go to the first slide, which had the title, "Will President Donald Trump be assassinated, ousted in a coup, or merely impeached?" Maybe we don't quite have the slides ready yet. Now, when the British say that, that is not a question. When the British say that, that is a statement of intent. And later, and people can reflect on the first year of the Trump administration, how many various, very blatant assassination threats, things that happen in Central Park at the Julius Caesar play, someone holding up President Trump's head as if to decapitate him in effigy, etc. Things that I thought were illegal or supposed to be illegal. Then later in there it is. There's the headline. This was January of 2017, the London Spectator. Thanks. So then by December of 2018, the British House of Lords put out a report on their role in a changing world order or something like that. And what they said in the report is that Donald Trump, in effect, could not be allowed to serve a second term, that it was a threat to the special relationship between the British and the United States, that this relationship could never be repaired if Trump were allowed to serve a second term. You might reflect on Pompeo just going over there and blathering about the wonderful special relationship between the US and the UK. But the House of Lords said that Trump could not be allowed to serve a second term, and one of the main things that they listed as a reason is that Trump had unilaterally acted to withdraw the United States from the Paris Climate Accords. Now, some people may say, well, what's the big deal? We don't want to have green energy. We don't want to shut down all of our industry. But what you're not understanding is there's another kind of green involved in the Green New Deal. And the green is money. That this, as I'm sure you're aware, is heavily funded by the City of London and Wall Street. It's not an accident that people like Ben Bernanke end up on the World Wildlife Fund. And the former head of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, who himself had called for regime change in nations to be replaced by central bankers and a single cryptocurrency to replace the dollar to be located at the Bank of England, spoke at something called the Task Force for Climate Financial Disclosure. If you can show the slide on that. So this is his speech at their meeting in 2019. And he says, the demand for TCFD disclosure is now enormous. Current supporters control balance sheets totaling $120 trillion and include the world's top banks, asset managers, pension funds, blah, blah. Next slide. Or if you say, I don't know if you can read this, but it's 12.6 billion or trillion in assets. So the US GDP is about $21.5 trillion. So think about the power of this conglomeration of groups, which includes every major bank, Citigroup, JP Morgan Chase, etc. Now think again about what the British are saying about Trump pulling the United States out of the Paris Climate Accord. That is a declaration of war against this. And it's not only money, it is also a policy of depopulation and genocide. Many people probably know that Prince Philip, the royal consort of the Queen of England, has said that, in fact, I was thinking he might be responsible for the coronavirus, because he said that if he died, he wanted to be reincarnated as a deadly virus. So as soon as I heard of it, I checked to see whether he was still alive or not. But the other part of green, I like to think of as gangrene, which is depopulation, it's genocide. Now, for people who are pawns in this game, perhaps like Defense Secretary Esper, who came over to his position from Raytheon, and who is he part of the military industrial complex that President Trump keeps identifying, who want these forever wars? I'm not sure. He's been very silent about certain matters. In cases like that, the lower level players, probably a lot of what they do with these perpetual wars and so on is about money. But for the higher levels, when you get to ideology, when you get to the British Empire, when you get to the City of London and so on, their game is geopolitics. It's worth knowing that Bertrand Russell, who was erroneously known as a great peace activist, thought that the United States should preemptively bomb the Soviet Union to prevent them from ever developing a nuclear weapon. So when you think about this British ideology, and you think about the power, at least in monetary terms, of what is allied against the integrity of the United States, what is allied to defend the Green New Deal, whether you call it $12 trillion or you call it $121 trillion, the United States alone, or China alone, which is the second major economy in the world, or Russia alone, will not be able to defeat it. And this is why Lyndon LaRouche said you absolutely have to have an agreement at least of the US, Russia, and China. The US and China are the two pillars because of their economic productivity, because of China's holdings of the US dollar, and then Russia, for obvious reasons, their science, their nuclear power. If India were in good shape, India should be part of it. Probably if the US, Russia, and China joined, India would join in. But you could outflank this blob known as the British Empire, which is based in the City of London and is these financial institutions, if you had a partnership among these nations. Now think about what Trump was saying when he came in. It would be good to have a good relationship with China and with Russia. What has he been attacked for ever since the first day? Russia. Russia hacked the election. So think about what is being thrown to prevent President Trump from having these meetings now, the summit that Helga Zepp-LaRouche has called for of US, Russia, China. Putin has called for the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, which is the US, UK, Russia, China, France. Any of these meetings, how can Trump possibly do it? What are we hearing? Russia, supposedly, has been offering bounties to the Taliban to kill American soldiers in Afghanistan. Well, there was no evidence, but they don't care about that. Russia, Putin poisoned Navalny, we're told. Now, first of all, Putin has about an 87% approval rating in Russia. He's formerly the head of the KGB. I would imagine if he intended to poison someone, they would probably be dead, and he has no need to have to do it. And like we heard from John Brennan, the former head of the CIA, when he testified in the Congress, and everyone says, where's the evidence? You might remember, Brennan said, I don't do evidence. We don't do evidence. And we've seen a lot of that in the United States with just egregious, crazy charges where no one has to prove anything. And then you get to the famous Russian hack, with which I'll let Kirk say something about later. There was, in fact, the evidence they had said there was no exfiltration of data, but nonetheless, we've heard about this ad nauseum. Then you have the situation with China. What do we hear? And unfortunately, it was repeated again today yesterday or today by President Trump at the UN. China lied about the virus. They kept the information from the world. They closed down Wuhan, but they were flying people all over the country. Well, someone actually got the flight records from the Wuhan airport. And the truth of the matter is that on January 23rd, when China stopped having flights go anywhere in China from Wuhan, they actually stopped all international flights. So this is not even true. Why is it being said? Because you cannot have the US and China, you cannot have these two huge economies collaborating, because the two of them combined will be more powerful than this British imperial mess. And we have now a situation which is extremely dangerous. People may have heard of the uh, provocations that we are waging on the border of Russia. Russian Su-27s have been intercepting American B-52 bombers. A couple weeks ago, one flew within 100 feet of the nose of one of our planes. 100 feet when you're going that speed is awfully alarming. And Mrs. LaRouche made the point, it's a terrible thing if whether we have World War III or not depends on the skills of a pilot. On the China question, we flew a fighter jet into the middle of a Chinese war drill where they were using live ammunition. And in response, they then fired 2 missiles, and they sent out a tweet saying, next time, don't be surprised if we shoot down your plane. So someone is going for a provocation. The danger of war could occur even before the so-called farce that we're calling an election, which is really not an election. The Democratic Party candidate is not there. He's losing his mind. The voting already started in early voting, where people are going to the polls, which is a sane approach, because if you can go to the grocery store, you can surely figure out a way to vote safely. But people are going to allow mail-in ballots in some states to be mailed until 10 days after the election. So November 3rd, you can forget it. We're certainly not going to know anything then. It'll be weeks, possibly. If you take the state of New York, where they had to already throw out 20% of the mail-in ballots in the primary, 20% can determine if someone wins or loses the election. So you're setting up a complete mess in that regard. And then you have the situation internal to the United States with complete chaos being unleashed. And it really is, I can only frankly use the word satanic when you actually hate human beings so much that you would be okay with people dying to serve your agenda, or you use people who are helpless or infirm, like we've seen here in New York City, where it was decided that because of COVID, you could not have the close packing of people crammed into the homeless shelters. You also released 20% of the prisoners in Rikers Island. And then the decision was made to move 10,000 of these people, many of whom have mental problems, drug addiction problems. You have people who were convicted sex offenders and so on, moved into luxury hotels around the city where they did not have the staff or the personnel to provide services and take care of them. And what happened, of course, is you had a lot of crime. People, you had only outdoor dining, so people who were mentally disturbed would come up and threaten to break a bottle over the head of someone at a restaurant, people defecating in the streets. And when this was contested, what did de Blasio do? And this is where you see how really satanic it is. They said, all right, we're going to move the people out of the hotels. We're going to put them into, it's all men, by the way, who were released, who are in these hotels. We're going to move them into a shelter in Hell's Kitchen from the Upper West Side. Well, that shelter was already full with women, so they had to move the women out. Where did they move them? They moved them to a shelter in Brooklyn where people have been living, this is families with children, for 2 years, and you're completely dislocating them and disrupting them. So I ask, is this not actually some kind of bizarre psychological experiment? Can you really be that idiotic and cruel and hard-hearted to use people as a weapon to create chaos, which is what you see going on here in the city. So we have a really extreme crisis, and it's in that context that Senator Black had warned some weeks ago about the possibility of a military coup, and I will let him say that, but I wanted to share with you something that has just been released from another administration, which some of you listening may remember, the administration of President John F. Kennedy, who was set up already when he came into office by people, Dulles, Lemnitzer, setting up the Bay of Pigs, which was presented to him as a fait accompli, and they made a gamble which didn't work. But then you had later the Cuba Missiles Crisis. Now I want to show you a document that was just released on Operation Northwoods, which was a proposal. This is Lemnitzer. You see his name down there. He was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. This was prior to the missiles crisis. He was trying to get Kennedy to invade Cuba, and he was trying to persuade Kennedy that you could get away with it. Next slide. So here are the proposals that were made in March of 1962. Bomb the U.S. base at Guantanamo, Cuba, and destroy U.S. ships. Lob mortar shells from outside of the base into the base. Blow up ammunition inside the base. Start fires. Burn aircraft on the base. Sabotage ship in harbor. Large fires. Naphthalene. Sink a ship near the harbor entrance. Conduct funerals for mock victims. We could blow up a drone unmanned anywhere in the Cuban waters. The presence of Cuban planes or ships investigating the intent of the vessel could be fairly compelling evidence that the ship was under attack. Lie to the news media. Now, that could never happen today. After an air-sea rescue operation to evacuate remaining members of the non-existent crew, casualty lists in the U.S. newspapers would cause a helpful wave of national indignation. Next, conduct terrorist atrocities inside the United States. We could develop a communist Cuban terror campaign in the Miami area. Okay, you get the idea. So this was actually a proposal that was made, and Kennedy rejected it. Then Lemnitzer said, well, why don't we just go ahead and invade Cuba? The Soviets probably wouldn't be bothered by that. Kennedy rejected that as well. Then you know what happened in terms of the missiles, and you also know what happened to President Kennedy, who was not willing to be part of this, who actually fired these people or had them removed to other posts, who intended to get us out of Vietnam, and who also intended that we were going to have a joint moon mission together with the Soviet Union. So that was not allowed to happen. So we are in a situation today where we can actually defeat this. Part of the reason that they are so desperate to risk nuclear war, to run an attempted coup against the President of the United States, is that the system of this British imperial financial blob is bankrupt and it's about to end. The disadvantage that they have is their rejection of the nature of man. You see it with the way de Blasio treats people in New York City, that they don't think that human beings are made in the image of God, but that human beings are merely animals to be thrown this way and that way. And the truth of the matter is that human beings have a potential each for genius. Every human being has a potential to become a creative genius. And that's what we have to protect. And there are certain programs like the space program, which President Trump has revived and funded to land the first woman and a man on the moon by 2024, which we should do, and we should do it in concert with other nations, not by ourselves and not in competition. There are 22 trillion galaxies out there. I don't know how many possible planets that means there are. We also have threats from asteroids that we don't even see coming, which could wipe out all life on Earth. So I think these are very compelling reasons for our nations to actually collaborate and for us to not be pitted against each other in these senseless wars. But that would require a dramatic shift, and that is what we have to organize, which is beyond the election. We have to defeat the coup, but we also have to win the policy. So with that, I will conclude, and I would like to turn this over to Senator Colonel Richard Black.
Well, thank you very much. It's a very good rundown on your part. I appreciate it. Just briefly introduce myself. I fought in the Marine Corps in Vietnam. I was a helicopter pilot, 269 combat missions, came back with bullet holes in the plane 4 times. I then volunteered to fight with the 1st Marine Division on the ground, was involved in very bitter combat that culminated when we were attacking to rescue a Marine outpost. I was wounded. Both of my radiomen were killed right beside me. I was involved in working with the Insurrection Act. In 1992, I had returned as a member of the Army Advocates General Corps, and I was involved in activating troops of the 7th Infantry Division for the relief of the LA riots in 1992. So I was a senior Judge Advocate General officer. I was eventually the chief of the Criminal Law Division and prepared executive orders for the president's signature, and testified before Congress and advised the Senate Armed Services Committee on issues of major importance. I have gone on. I was elected to the Virginia House of Delegates, served for 4 terms, 8 years, and then I was elected to the Senate, and I also served 2 terms, which was 8 years in the Senate. During that time, because of my work with Syria, I was named among 3 Americans as an enemy of ISIS, and they called me the American Crusader, which I accept. I think that's a badge of honor. But I've become very concerned recently because when there were riots, violent riots in DC, the president felt a need to reassert and to ensure the American people that the government was in control. So he lawfully employed National Guard troops to clear the way so that he could walk from the White House over to St. John's, which had been torched by violent rioters a couple of nights before. He went there, he held up a Bible, making the point that, number one, the government is in control. We have not relinquished control of Washington, D.C. Number two, we respect religious freedom and we will defend its rights against people who would torch churches and destroy them. In any event, a considerable number of very senior generals, a lot of 4-star generals, came out and they issued scathing denunciations of the president for doing what was a very legitimate thing. And in the course of their denunciations, they praised the rioters, and they made comments about how we needed to be respectful, and how the rioters were justifiably holding these peaceful protests to make their points. And frankly, these generals needed to look a little bit closer at whether it was peaceful to torch buildings, to murder police officers, to intimidate, to beat ordinary citizens, to force them to kneel down and to plead for their lives to Black Lives Matter and other radical organizations. But in any event, they did that, and it got my attention, and I began to look into it. And it turns out that on June the 4th, there was a prominent publication, Foreign Policies, very well known to many of your audience, and it was entitled Generals Denounce Trump's Protest Crackdown Plan. They criticized him for raising the possibility that he might invoke the Insurrection Act, and they dismissed it as just being a 2-century-old law. Well, the Constitution's been around for a long time, so a lot of old laws are very important, and this is one of the most elemental legal things that we've got on the books. The Insurrection Act has been invoked 22 times by a dozen different presidents, the most recent of which was H.W. Bush. But in any event, in concert with this type of criticism, Defense One, which is a very highly respected online publication, it has advertisers like Boeing, Raytheon, very respected companies, and they published an open letter by 2 lieutenant colonels, John Nagel and Paul Yingling. In this letter, these 2 lieutenant colonels, they addressed it to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, and they said, if Donald Trump refuses to leave office at the expiration of his constitutional term, the U.S. military must remove him by force, and you must give the order. So you had these 2 lieutenant colonels who were urging a coup to overthrow the government of the United States, which, it should go without saying, is impermissible for retired military officers. But at the same time, you started seeing other things that were issued. In particular, you had General Mattis. Now, General Mattis had been the Secretary of Defense. He resigned when President Trump announced that he was pulling all troops from Syria. And the purpose of his resignation was to create a gap in the chain of command so that the president could not carry out his promise to remove the troops. John Bolton immediately flew to Tel Aviv and rescinded the president's orders. So that was the background on General Mattis. Now, General Mattis, of course, is a retired 4-star general, and he is subject to military law because of that. But he came out and he really savaged the president, and he praised the rioters for their wholesome and unifying demands. And if you think that the rioters in Seattle and Portland and all of these other cities are somehow wholesome and unifying, then your concept of the English language is rather strange. But he then went on and he made a rather frightening comment, and he said of the president, he said, we're witnessing the consequences of 3 years without mature leadership. Then he went on to say, we can unite without him. Now, just what did he mean by saying that we can unite without the President of the United States? Now, interestingly, as unnerving as that particular pronouncement was by General Mattis, we now have the previews of a book that has just been released by Bob Woodward, very, very left-wing, hard left-wing liberal, and he quotes General James Mattis, who was then talking to Dan Coates, the Director of National Intelligence. They were having a private conversation, and Mattis said, there may come a time when we have to take collective action against President Trump. Now, I guess you can view it different ways, but when I see the Secretary of Defense talking about the need for taking collective action, and he's talking to the Director of National Intelligence, I don't think he's talking about we need to rally the troops for Biden and try to get him elected. I think they're talking about something much more sinister. And my concern is that we then had sort of in rapid fire. It was obviously very well coordinated, and we had General Colin Powell, who then came out and he led a group of military leaders in blasting the commander in chief in the harshest possible language. General Colin Powell said that he agreed that Trump was the first president in his lifetime who was not trying to unite the country. And I always remind people that they need to remember that Colin Powell was the individual who very famously waved a simulated test tube of sarin gas in order to convince the United Nations to take action against Iraq, which had done nothing to anyone, had never done anything hostile to anyone. And as a result of his deception and his guile, he's managed to perhaps kill 2 million innocent people over there. So this was Colin Powell's contribution. Since then, we've had dozens and dozens of very senior officers, including, unfortunately, some Marine officers. Now, I was a Marine. I fought in Vietnam. I was wounded. My radiomen were killed right beside me, and so I know about the self-sacrifice of Marines. But these Marine generals, some of their comments are very, very concerning. For example, Marine Corps General John Allen very arrogantly claimed Donald Trump isn't religious, he has no need for religion, and he doesn't care about the devout, except insofar as they serve his political needs. Navy Admiral Mike Mullen said, "It sickened me yesterday to see security people, including the National Guard, forcibly and violently clearing a path through Lafayette Square." There's a lot of violence on the other side, and there was no need for violence except that the president was faced by violent elements, and he certainly has a right to walk where he wants and when he wants, and to be defended by the National Guard if that proves necessary. So we've seen these things happening rapid fire. Many of these generals, and I'm not going to specify which ones, but they appear to be possibly in violation of Article 88 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, which condemns the use of contemptuous words against the president. A general officer can disagree with a policy of the president, but he cannot use contemptuous words, which are really designed to undermine the legitimacy of the president himself. So those are punishable offenses. So we have these things happening. I am trying to shine light on the fact that this is underway. I'm not the only one who has observed this. Just the other day, the Federalist came out with a report, and Federalist is as respected as any organization I know. The title of it was "The Left is Setting the Stage for a Coup if Trump Wins." So we see these things happening very rapid fire, and I have discovered one article. Now, this goes back to 2017. It was a British publication, interestingly, in The Conversation. It's entitled "Thinking the Unthinkable: Could There Be a Military Coup in the United States?" And it essentially lays out a plan for the overthrow of the President of the United States. It even goes so far as to say that in order to shut down communications across the continent, the U.S. Cyber Command should stage a false flag attack. And it recognized that we have now developed software where we can conduct a cyber attack and we can make it appear as though it has come from another nation, Russia, China, whatever. And they say in there that the cyber attack could be staged to look like it came from a foreign enemy, and the narrative of foreign attack could then provide the pretext for deploying troops to the streets. They go on to actually lay out an order of battle of which troops should be deployed. They talk about the ease with which President Trump could be captured at Mar-a-Lago because it's on a peninsula. They said it'd be very easy to secure and to capture the president. It lays out basically an entire scheme, a plan of action to take down the government. And so my interest in being here tonight is that as the former chief of the Criminal Law Division for the Army, responsible for enforcing military justice throughout the world to military people all over the world, is to make the point that there is nothing within the Constitution that suggests that the military has any role in sorting out any dispute over who is the legitimate president. We have constitutional mechanisms through the executive branch, the legislative branch, the judicial branch that can sort these things out. We had a similar problem with Al Gore back years ago, and it was solved, and this one can be solved also. But I think it's important for us right now to shine light on this because we have more than hints that this is something that is a very distinct Plan B. And I think by shining the light on it early on, we can make it very difficult for the military, for these top generals, to deceive the lower ranks and put them out on the streets against the American people and use that as a mechanism to overthrow the government of the United States. That is my objective.
Great. Thank you very much. And I would just underscore, I think this is why we urgently need the vacant seat on the Supreme Court filled before the elections, when it may be months before we even know who is in the Congress, let alone the White House. So now I would like to ask Mr. Wiebe to go ahead.
Good evening. Let me first say that Colonel Black, I salute you. That discourse you just provided us is truly enlightening, and it should be shocking to our viewers. And I see parallels. And what I mean is, I see a disrespect for the law, whether it be senior officers in the U.S. military that you have just described, whether it be a Congress that's willing to do anything to unseat a president, making a mockery of what powers Congress actually has. We have, it appears we have a ruling elite, and I'm not including President Trump in that or his immediate administration, because I really believe they're trying to reestablish respect and the functioning of the U.S. Constitution the way it was intended to be implemented throughout government. And the primary customer of it is, of course, the American people. I see a disregard for the American people when the ruling elite began to offer solutions that you've just described in our senior officer corps. And that erosion of respect for the Constitution is really a broader disrespect of the law, the greater body of law by which we manage society and through which we underline and emphasize the spirit of values that at one time formed a fabric that united Americans at a foundational level. We had disagreements on methods sometimes and the best thing to do, but we had a common bond of loyalty to the Constitution, respect for the law, and that fabric, that foundational pillar, if you will, has been severely damaged in this country. And it plays in the issue of NSA. Now, many of you know I was a senior analyst at NSA over 32 years of service. I enjoyed that service until the ruling elite thought it was okay to turn that surveillance machinery, which is very necessary to national security, turn it against the American people. The excuse was 9/11. What if a terrorist sits among us? How will we find them? We must surveil domestic communications. Now that sounds to many reasonable until you realize that that mentality, that approach throws the law out the window. We had laws prohibiting the surveillance of Americans, except when there's probable cause. We always could surveil Americans when there's probable cause. Now, General Hayden, former director of NSA, when Bill Binney and I were there, reworded or re-emphasized the thrust of the Fourth Amendment of the Constitution, which basically says that Americans have a right to be secure in their personal effects. And of course, that language used in the late 1700s described communications in terms of letters, papers, things that people wrote. They enjoyed privacy. Somehow in the digital age, we have found ways to skew the intent of the Constitution. To say, for example, and you've heard this, oh, it's okay if we collect metadata. Metadata is a fancy techie term for addresses. Think of your house address. Think of your email address. Think of your telephone number as an address. Think of your chat name, your Instagram handle or name. All of these things are addresses that single you out from everybody else participating in these various social media. And they said, it's okay to collect that kind of stuff. Let me tell you, metadata collected in real time or near real time, when done so comprehensively, can actually tell more about you, especially if I get into the metadata associated with your life. Banking, you have an account number. Credit card, you have an account number. It's unique to you. I can correlate all of these addresses and unique aspects of your life and literally watch you as you interface with each of these systems. You stop at a gas station. You pay with a credit card. On that receipt is a date, a time, and a location. I now know where you are. And I also know where you are if you get on the Dulles Greenway down in Virginia and go through a transponder that again records where you are, when, on what day. So if I take all of this information that I'm collecting just metadata, I can basically profile and account for you throughout your entire day. And I would tell you, there is no, and I want to contrast that with the law, again, because it kind of protects content unless you have a court order. Metadata is fine, but don't you touch the content. Now, that's a little bit of a, I don't want to call it a false flag, let's call it a red herring, a ruse, because where can I find content that describes what I just told you that metadata can provide? Your whereabouts and activities throughout the entire day. I don't know. I don't generate that content when I talk to people. Oh, here's what I did today and list it all. Nobody does that. But through metadata, I know what you did. I know who you called. I know that you called your psychiatrist. I wonder why you're calling a psychiatrist or a doctor or this or that. The point of it is the ruling elite, and I'm going to use this term, I'll use the term perverted the law to get their way to control information. Now, we fought a war, in part, a war of independence because the King of England wanted to station a soldier in every colonial home, not just to give them a place to live, but to spy on the colonists, to hear what was being discussed and suggested. He wanted to do that. The colonists said, no, you cannot be privy to our most sensitive thoughts about politics, intentions, whatever it may be. That's a fundamental right under our Constitution. So at that point, I'll leave it because I thought Colonel Black provided a wonderful introduction to this notion that our system of law and justice is under attack, and without that, we will surely crumble. Diane?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. So now we will turn things over to Mr. Jatras, former advisor to the Senate Republican leadership.
First, let me say I should turn on my microphone. Let's start with that. Thank you, Diane. I appreciate the introduction. And let me first say that I'm honored to take part in this discussion, especially with such distinguished patriots who have served our country for so long with such dedication and such honesty. I have to confess, though, that I do not share their rosy optimism about the future. And obviously, they are not optimistic, and I perhaps am even more pessimistic about the situation we face. Let me just say very briefly that in terms of my own background in government service, I first worked at the U.S. State Department as a Foreign Service officer, serving in Mexico, and then at what was then the Soviet Union desk at the State Department, where I had a reputation of being one of the rare, if you can believe it, anti-communists in the whole building. It was a very unusual thing to find in those days, even under the Reagan administration. And then later, I worked for about 17 years in the U.S. Senate Republican leadership on Capitol Hill. So I guess I can say I've seen the inside of this beast from both the executive and legislative perspective. So nothing I hear from Colonel Black or from Kirk is particularly surprising, though it is shocking, and it should be shocking to any American to see how far down the road we have gone to the loss of our liberties. And then, as Diana's pointed out, how far down the road we have gone to what is really an existential danger to the survival of our country, and really as our survival as physical living human beings, as to the biological survival of the human race, and not only of the United States. So I think that the previous speakers have painted a very chilling picture. I think Senator Black, in terms of what we're looking at in the upcoming election, well, really the election that's already started, because we have people that have already begun voting. We have all sorts of this crazy quilt of when mail-in ballots will be allowed and when they will be counted that seem to be designed to leave us hanging as to who the actual winner is and to provide maximum opportunity for the kind of seizure of power that these people are telegraphing. I think that whether or not Trump wins, and when we even know when Trump or Biden wins this election, we're in for a really rough patch. That if Trump wins, uh, it's hard to see the other side conceding a clean victory, and that the kind of disorder and the violence of what we've seen in the streets over the last few months will be accelerated to a degree we can barely imagine right now, and how the government will actually deal with that. I think, and indeed, whether these very institutions that have been, I think Kirk put it properly, perverted, will obey lawful orders to defend the constitutional order in the face of what is in fact an insurrection. That legal authority is there, but do the laws and the constitutions, do the laws and the Constitution really apply in a realistic sense anymore? Contrariwise, if Biden wins, I think these coup-meisters, these people that have been talking like this and telegraphing their willingness to seize power, will feel that their ultimate objective is within reach through more or less legitimate means, that they will have a green light to seize the levers of power and to enact what is, I would say, kind of a woke dictatorship of some sort. Other people have called it a soft totalitarianism. I think, in a sense, this may be the last real election in American history, and we're not even sure if this one will turn out to be a real election, if it will allow to be conducted along constitutional lines. And I think part of that is what Kirk spelled out, and Bill Binney and others have pointed this out. This whole Russiagate hoax, which is designed above all to make sure that there can be no rapprochement with between Moscow and Washington. Of course, this is also necessary with Beijing as well. It was rather saddening, I guess, as a mild word, to listen to President Trump's speech at the UN today, where I think he devoted the first quarter or third of his speech to just bashing China, which I guess he must feel he must do in order to be, hairy-chested and strong. I'm standing up for America, without I think recognizing the extent to which that itself becomes a tool in the kind of fear-mongering and paranoia about foreign interference in our election. Of course, that based on the lies about Russiagate from 2016, the hack of the DNC that did not take place, the social media interference, which is really now being used as an excuse for what amounts to censorship, for the abridgment of Americans' free speech rights, which of course isn't really a constitutional violation because they're private corporations doing it. It's not the government, so it's okay. This is the line we're getting from many people even call themselves conservatives. I think that Kirk very well laid out the extent to which the surveillance state has become so all pervasive, and that this also applies, I think, to some of the measures we're taking in the name of public health, testing, social distancing, which will also augment the existing technologies for social surveillance. This is pervasive in the financial sector. Over the last few years, I had conducted a lot of education and even lobbying against a law called FATCA that was enacted in 2010, which I don't know how many Americans know this. Anytime you fill out a tax form, it asks you for a FATCA disclosure, because if you want to know about critical information to Americans' private lives and invaluable information for the surveillance state, their finances are key to that. So I think we're all increasingly in a fishbowl that is run by the kind of people that are threatening our constitutional order, who feel that they are on the verge of victory, and they just need to either seize power if Trump even nominally wins the election, or even better, if they can manage it, to take power if they are handed it on a platter by the Biden-Harris administration. Or I should rather say, as both of them have said, the Harris-Biden administration. because I think we all know that Mr. Biden is not really all there. And what does this mean now? And I think this gets back to the point that Diane opened with, to our survival, because I think we've seen that Trump has been boxed in by all this Russiagate nonsense. And plus, let's be honest, he's made some horrible, horrible appointments to his team and those running his foreign and national security policy. And I'm not speaking, of them necessarily as their value as individuals like John Bolton and Mike Pompeo and Esper and some of the others. Maybe they're very nice people, but the fact of the matter is that their policy prescriptions are simply a continuation of the kind of disastrous overextension of American power and indeed a quest for global domination that has nothing to do with the national interest of the United States, that is, unless checked, and checked very soon, will inevitably lead us to a catastrophic confrontation with Russia or China or both. Perhaps some kind of an incident with Iran would be used as a trigger to do that. We've seen that Trump has said over and over again he wants to get out of Afghanistan and Syria, but nonetheless, we don't do that. And if you look at Syria, we're actually sending more troops and more armored vehicles to Syria. So even under these circumstances, and even if Trump is reelected, it's hard to see how this hamster jumps off the treadmill, and we don't continue to keep going down the road to disaster. And then, of course, if Biden wins, his shadow Secretary of State is Nick Burns. He's got Evelyn Farkas lined up for the Pentagon. This is if we think that the confrontational attitude toward Russia in particular has gotten much worse even under this administration, I think it's Katie bar the door if Biden gets elected. I know that in an earlier conference of the Schiller Institute, some of the same speakers spoke out of the need to have an understanding among the big three to start with: Russia, China, and the United States, and maybe include India and maybe some other countries as well. I see so many articles that say we should do this, we should do that, we must do this, we must do that. I guess what upsets me the most is what happens when all these shoulds and musts don't take place. That when the band plays on, when the trajectory toward a nuclear 1914 continues with this heedless, reckless rush to disaster. We have, as Americans, as voters, very few tools at our disposal. And I don't think this conference is supposed to be a partisan gathering. But I guess what I tend to see is if Trump wins, maybe there's still some hope. Maybe that if he wins and he's reinvigorated politically, he can actually appoint good team, change the trajectory of American policy. Whereas if the other side wins, those possibilities are much, much, much slimmer. And that the time is, I think, growing short. The paths open to us, the various alternatives to the off ramps from what is a stumbling forward into an abyss those off ramps are going to be fewer and farther between as we move forward. So I hope a conference like this can reach out to people on social media and through other places if we don't get censored by the tech giants for, let's see, being a Russia propaganda or hate speech or whatever their latest excuse is for muzzling views that they don't like, and that enough Americans can somehow, through the options available to us, stand up for the historic values of our country, for the laws, for the Constitution, and for everything that I know that Colonel Black, my father, and others in government service have tried to uphold through all these years to build and preserve the kind of Americans the founding fathers gave us.
Great. Thank you very much. So just so people know, because I see there are some people with questions, we're going to now go to Daniel Burke, my colleague, who is an independent candidate for U.S. Senate in New Jersey against Cory Booker. And then there may be a couple of things that people on the panel would like to say, and then we will open it up for questions. But Daniel, why don't you go ahead?
Thank you very much, Diane, and thank you to all of the speakers who came before me. I can only echo what Mr. Jatras said, that I'm quite honored to be a part of this gathering, but I extend that also to you, Mr. Jatras. So I'm going to play my humble role, which has been I initiated this outsider campaign for U.S. Senate because I felt that something needed to be done to actually reach young people in this country and across the world in many other countries who have never heard of what we're doing, this LaRouche movement, and actually give them some of the insights that I felt actually gave me an ability to know what's going on in the world and to conceive of a solution. And so I'm really dedicated to the idea that what has been communicated thus far in this discussion tonight can be heard and must be heard. Well, to take up the musts and the shoulds, really, it's our responsibility. I'll put it that way, and it's our joy to actually communicate this to youth across the country. And I'm thinking through over and over again ways to do that because I think that there's something unique about a youth generation, that they actually have 50 years ahead of them at least of activity in our country, and they begin to think about things and in the universe. They begin to think about things from that standpoint. But in addition to that, I really want to consider that what we're orchestrating right now, or orchestrating may be over the top, but what we're engaged in is the creation of a building counter coup. And that's how I think it would benefit those of us who are moved by this these presentations and so forth. Consider yourself part of that. Or as Lyndon LaRouche called it in a document he wrote, I think in 1987, that was recently referenced by Barbara Boyd in a new article that went up on the LaRouche PAC website just today. He said it's the people's war. That is, it's the fight back of the people against this elite to which Mr. Wiebe referred. We're in a war that is going to be won according to a certain decisive action to deal with axioms, or to deal with, I would say, the core rot within the moral culture of the United States, and indeed in most so-called Western countries. And so from that standpoint, I think we should actually take a lot of courage. First of all, from the fact that we've been able to pull together our, people as we have tonight, who can speak from experience and from their own actions taken in defense of the principles of the United States Constitution. Very serious life-risking actions that were taken to preserve that. But then to take a look at what has been done by President Trump that qualifies as decisive action in the right direction. Because we need to take that and we need to develop it, and we need to actually, clarify for people just what can be done on this basis. It's within the last hour, I believe, that it's been announced that President Trump has signed an executive order essentially banning critical race theory from being included in anything from the U.S. government, any institution of the U.S. government, as well as any federal contractors. So we will not be using federal contractors who are using critical race theory trainings on their, in their companies. And this is, to my knowledge, the first time since the new left, cultural degeneracy has been introduced, with the possible exception of Ronald Reagan, that you have a legitimate action by the U.S. president to oppose this slide towards a do as thou wilt kind of collapse of the principled understanding of the purpose of human civilization that we have as Americans. Because, the United States Republic goes back to ancient Athens. It goes back to the fight between Plato and Aristotle as to whether the reason should be king or oligarchy, which is, I think, very clearly what Aristotle wanted. And it goes back to 400 years ago this year, 1620, when we had the Pilgrims arrive in what is now the United States. From the standpoint, they came in devotion to the principle that all men are created in the living image of God. That's why they came. That's the whole purpose. If you read the work of, for example, Brewster, I think, one of the key early members of that Pilgrim team, that was the devotion that they had. That's what we have to live up to. President Trump is now standing against what has been done to those principles and attacking the 1619 Project, attacking the sort of Howard Zinn cynicism that has been so heavily foisted upon the people and, beyond belief, taught to youth, taught to young, to children, that the United States is by nature racist, that the nation was founded with no purpose other than to perpetuate slavery. These are pernicious lies, most of all because not just merely because they're slanderous and false, but because they lock away from people what their own character is. Because as you begin to accept the belief that that's how the country was organized, then you begin to see yourself as living within that context. And that's why you see like all types of absurdities today, like as the kneeling that Colonel Black referred to, and the bizarre sort of revivalist church kind of scenarios that are happening at these protests. But then, just like, for example, a lot of people who are getting caught out for faking their race, white people who are pretending to be black or Hispanic and getting caught for doing this. This is the kind of absurdities of the present moral decadence. And certainly, the more dangerous elements of that type of outlook on man, which is exactly what Mr. Jatras referred to. I'm extremely concerned that we could have a world war triggered before any election even takes place. I think that we should essentially consider that we're living on borrowed time because, the fact that we've gotten this far into the process of a breakdown of relations is something that we really we're fortunate for. Where it's really that we're lucky that we've made it this far. But if we're going to turn the tide, if we're going to shift things, then I think that this attack upon the intentional cultural program of destruction of the American people, which is what the New Left is, and that's what Lyndon LaRouche dealt with from the beginning. Lyndon LaRouche in the late 1960s, when he was the one who prevented the Weathermen from having a celebration of Bobby Kennedy's assassination. Mr. LaRouche, who was organizing a student movement, actually intervened and prevented them from celebrating the assassination of Bobby Kennedy publicly in an event with the SDS. So he's been against this from the beginning. He's been that's always what Mr. LaRouche campaigned to destroy, because he saw what were the implications and where does this come from? What are the actual intentions of the Frankfurt School, for example, to degrade mankind, to bring people down and down and down to the point that they accept satanic policies like deterrence, where, I'm going to kill somebody so that they don't, so that they don't get to do anything bad. And that's how I can prove I'm a good person. But I want to sort of bring this to what I think are a couple of other flanks that are necessary. Because one, I believe that we need to develop and understand and communicate to many people across the world and across the United States what is the true character of the United States. This plays into the strategic situation because there's a lot of Chinese who have no idea what the real United States is, and they believe a bunch of crap about who the U.S. is because of all of the frauds that have been perpetrated on people of the world about this racist, terrible United States and all the terrible things that we actually represent. And they don't know the actual principles of our Constitution. So we got to develop that. But then I also want to point out that the original 1968, New Left kind of operation was introduced in the wake of the assassination of John Kennedy and the takedown of the crash program for the Apollo program, for the moon landing. In other words, it wasn't that, NASA was completely destroyed, but if you look at the percentage of GDP that was devoted to NASA, or the percentage of the budget, that is, that was devoted to NASA in 1963, 1962, as compared to 1968, it was drastically reduced. As soon as Kennedy was killed, we lost that track. And, that's where they introduced this incredible cultural cynicism that leads to this totally unprincipled, narrative development that we're dealing with today. And that's where I think that the Artemis program, which Trump has, this is, I think, his greatest policy presently. This is the other clear place where he is absolutely right on. We're going to put human beings back on the moon in 2024. So my daughter, who's 2 years old, is going to be 6 years old, and she's going to watch Americans walking on the moon. They're going to stay there for 2 weeks. And NASA just released a major report today talking about how to achieve that. And what is it going to take? Which, it has a lot more than I won't say now. And then the final two things I want to point out would actually represent a kind of a flanking operation to, move the counter coup forward, to take the people who are just incredibly energized to stop this Harris Biden administration, and actually do something with them. I think the case of exonerating Lyndon LaRouche is a really good one. And this Saturday, I'm going to be speaking as a moderator at a LaRouche Schiller Institute conference for youth across the world, with a focus on Mr. LaRouche's exoneration, because it would actually open up for people some of the things that would work. Some of the policies and the principles that would work to take this, this upswell of opposition and make it potent, as opposed to, completely under the spell of frankly, warmongers of every type. And finally, I want to point out that at the UNGA today, we had President Putin call again for this P5 or G5 summit. And I think that demonstrates that there's an international strategic situation where there are many people outside of the United States who recognize how disastrous the scenario has become, and they will work with the Trump administration that has enough, juice in it. And that's why I think, to your point, Jim, on personnel, the best thing Trump could do would be to hire the three gentlemen on this panel and bring them into the administration next in the next year, hoping that you guys would be willing to serve. So that's what I'll conclude with.
Great. Thank you, Daniel. I would definitely second that. And I would also propose that some of the people who we've mentioned earlier, like Brennan and others, should be put in prison where they belong, and they could have a fair trial first, of course. But the crimes that have been committed are so massive, it seems that we should really start going after them. Now, I just wanted to open things up if people on this panel have comments, and I actually wanted to ask Kirk if you could just review one thing which you've said in other calls, and it was very striking to me about 9/11 and the fact that it could have been prevented, and that you know that.
Yeah. Let's see if I can do this succinctly and clearly. There's so much surrounding 9/11, as you know. The crucial communications that gave NSA a window into the activities of Al-Qaeda were telephone, and that includes typical telephone that across Earth, and satellite telephones. So really the terrestrial telephone system was augmented by satellite phones, and that's often dictated by terrain, such as China uses a lot of satellite phone because of the mountain ridges throughout the country, and that blocks line of sight communications. So we knew it was telephone. Now, let me tell you, people will obscure the discussion about 9/11 by saying, well, technologically, it was hard. We really didn't know that the communications from San Diego or from those two terrorists going to the Yemen house in Yemen, we only heard one side, or we weren't sure which was which. That's a ruse. If the telephone company, and I ask all of you to think about this, let this sink in. If the telephone company running their telephone lines are so good at tracking phone calls that they know exactly who to bill and how much to charge, don't you think the National Security Agency would have been at least that smart? Think about that. Sure they were. So this leads us to the surprise that everyone seems to be interested in. NSA captured the communications even without thin thread. That's that research project Benny and I and others were working to exploit the internet. So at that time, at that point in time, think of two networks. You have the internet that you typically use to send email, send pictures, that kind of thing. And technically we call that TCP/IP, to move that kind of information across the internet globally. And then you have the telephone network. Now today, it's hard to distinguish between the two because you can send TCP/IP over the phone networks, and you all know you have certain addresses you can use if you want to use Verizon, et cetera, et cetera. So all of that's merging into a giant network that's much more flexible. So let's go back to 9/11 and that point in time. Telephone was well understood, the numbering system, the allocation of phone numbers internationally. All the countries have different country codes, as we know, and regions within that. Excuse my dog, I'm going to let the dog out so that I can speak. Come on.
Okay.
Go, Lola. Okay, I think we're back. All right. So the point of it is, NSA knew what it had, it knew what subscribers it had, and it even captured communications that foretold the planning of 9/11. In other words, we knew it was going to happen, and analysts inside NSA were going to report that and got stopped by the director of NSA. Why? We don't know exactly. Could it be that people were afraid that the ramifications for Saudi Arabia would be too much to handle, that it might topple the royal family? We know that the Bush family was close with the Saudis. Was there some diplomatic side to this that people didn't want to upset the apple cart? And maybe no one knew that the effect of 9/11 in terms of toppling the towers, hitting the Pentagon, crashing the plane in Pennsylvania, none of that would be known. So people may have just made slight of it and therefore thought it was better not to report the information because of the upheaval it would cause internationally. I don't care. 3,000 people died. The job of the National Security Agency is to provide national security, not worry about the political whims of someone sitting in the White House or somewhere else. We have a duty, we have an oath, and we have to uphold it. But again, it goes back to the perversion of the law and then its cousin called policy. And now policy is up for grabs, depending on hidden agendas by leadership, elites in agencies, White House, centers of power throughout the government. Muddies the waters. And that's the essential point I wanted to make. Could Thin Thread have detected those communications? Of course. Of course it could have. But the kicker is, NSA already had detected them with their existing capabilities. We just would have had it twice or maybe 3 times, depending on different sources of information. Diane?
Great, thank you. So Senator Black, do you have any thoughts you'd like to share now, given what's been said?
Just in response to that, something that was very interesting that was not broadcast on the media was the fact that immediately after 9/11, when the Twin Towers fell, the President of the United States, George Bush, ordered all jet aircraft grounded, all civil aviation grounded. And so we had, for the first time in American history, no jets were in the air, no passenger jets, only military. The very first jet that was authorized to take off was at the request of the Saudi government. They took a jet and they flew from city to city and they picked up the relatives of Osama bin Laden and certain very sensitive, high-level Saudi officials, and they flew them out of the country to Saudi Arabia, where they were outside of the distance of any congressional inquiries. Why did we do this? Why did the president authorize this? We will never know, but he was a bit too close to Saudi Arabia. And under anybody's reasonable analysis, the United States on 9/11 was attacked by Saudi Arabia. Almost all of the drivers of the planes were Saudi Arabians, and they were supported by certain very high-level Saudi officials, members of the government, who were funding them. And so in order to partly in order to distract attention from what the Saudis had done, we took off and we attacked Iraq, which had nothing to do with 9/11, which had never attacked us, which had never taken any offensive action against the United States. And to some extent, it was simply a diversion, because had the American people focused on exactly what happened on 9/11, at a certain point, they'd have said, that's a lot of Saudi Arabians flying those jets. And also we're seeing that Saudi officials, members of the Saudi government, are personally funding individuals who are taking the training to fly those jets that crashed into the Twin Towers. Now, however you look, 9/11, a lot of complexity, but we do know that the people who flew the planes were Al-Qaeda. What is so unnerving is that the United States has consistently, dogmatically supported Al-Qaeda almost from that time. We supported them when we invaded Libya. We have supported them for the last 9 years, almost 10 years in Syria. Basically, you have the legitimate, duly elected constitutional government of Syria versus Al-Qaeda and some of its allies. We have always supported Al-Qaeda without question. The Defense Intelligence Agency back in 2013 did a complete review of Syrian policy, and among the findings, which were very concerning, was that the Central Intelligence Agency was running a program called Timber Sycamore, And under Timber Sycamore, the CIA was taking weapons that had been plundered from Libya after we overturned the government there, and we were shipping them using Qatari aircraft. We were shipping them to Turkey and then across the border. And the Defense Intelligence Agency found that those weapons were being distributed indiscriminately to all rebel groups in Syria, including specifically ISIS and Al Qaeda. So we know that for a fact. We know that in the border invasions across border from Turkey into areas of Syria, that the United States made an emergency shipment of TOW anti-tank missiles to supply the Al Qaeda forces. They made a four-pronged attack at a beautiful Christian village called Kasab, and they managed to overwhelm the Syrian army because of the emergency shipment of TOW missiles that Central Intelligence Agencies sent to supply the forces that were attacking. 13 of the Christians who the Syrians could not get them out quickly enough, they were all beheaded. And the Al Qaeda forces, armed with these American TOW anti-tank missiles, desecrated all of the churches, and then they took sledgehammers and they smashed down ancient headstones of Christians who had fled Turkish persecution and genocide years earlier. The United States has done this. It is so just unbelievable that almost immediately after 3,000 Americans died at the Twin Towers and Pentagon, some of them jumping a quarter of a mile to their deaths on the sidewalk. And then the CIA turns around and aligns itself with Al Qaeda, the group that flew the jets. Just stunning. And it just shows the depth of sickness and poison within the U.S. foreign policy establishment today.
Thank you. I think many people will find that very disturbing. I think Jim will call on you in the questions because they're piling up, and I want to make sure we can get to people who I think have a lot that they'd like to know. Right now, we're going to go to Derek Gibson, who is a candidate for governor of New York in 2022. Derek, why don't you go ahead? Are you muted? We
Good
can't hear
afternoon,
you.
and thank you, Colonel Black, for that very informative information. And I really just have a statement at this point. I did have a couple of questions, but from hearing the depth of what you were saying, it really stunned me. Kurt made me want to get out of my bed and just hide. I really too much information for me. But I have been saying for a long time, I am 59 years old. I've been watching the U.S. government and what they have been doing, and I have been saying that we are being led blindly. There are two narratives out there. It's one going this way, it's one going that way. And the same tactics that they used on President Trump, I looked at it and I say these are the same tactics that has been used on poor whites and poor blacks to trap you up and remove you from certain areas or certain positions in life. So you are 100% correct. And I just want to know, would you have a problem if I actually took this and gave it to President Trump?
Sure. I wish that we were able to communicate with him. I think the people who surround him are not people who are giving him straight information.
Right.
Ironically, when he meets with foreign leaders like President Putin, he's getting real information. And I think that's part of the reason that they get so nervous every time that he has one of these meetings where he interfaces with foreign leaders. without having the filter of the Central Intelligence Agency and the State Department.
Right. Okay, I can arrange that if you agree to that. I can arrange it. So once I get this recording I will take it and give it to Don Jr. and I'll also give it to Dr. Carson, which is my cousin, and he will get it to President Trump, and I can arrange so you can get to President Trump and have a direct meeting with him if that's okay with you.
We would love
Sure.
that.
Thank you. I have another Zoom meeting coming up, so I hate to leave because it was very informative, but I'm gonna have to go, and I want to say hello to everybody on here, Daniel, my friend, Diane, and the rest. Y'all have a great night.
Great.
Good night.
Thank
Thank
you.
Thanks for the
Thank you
information.
very much. Thank you. Good. I think we will go to Ken now. Are you able to unmute?
Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay. Well, first, Diane, thank you for putting this together, and to Colonel Black for your service and for sticking your neck out, telling us about this. Mr. Wiebe for the information. We can't get anything straight from the NSA. Mr. Jaffris, excellent. And Daniel, anybody that's willing to stick their neck out, like Diane, and get their character assassinated by running for office, my hat's off to you. I'm not sure where to start. The question is kind of simple, but there's so much. My only exposure to military laws, I had watched a few episodes of JAG way back in the day. But I'm watching Colonel Vindman, right? When he's explaining in the impeachment hearings that the president didn't follow his talking points, and I think he's got the roles reversed. Why this guy's not even court-martialed is beyond my understanding. Some of these other, generals or whatever, the documents exist. Isn't that, where's the DOJ or whatever the military law section would be? I mean, it seems like there's an insurgency, insurrection, sedition. Nobody's getting charged with anything. I just can't fathom it. Just the other day, Nancy Pelosi is talking to that idiot Stephanopoulos and refers to the president as a henchman, and she all the tools, all the arrows in her quiver, which the House has nothing to do with anything relative to this. I mean, it's just mind-blowing to me. It seems like we have domestic terrorism going on, and yet even though we seem to know it, and the president seems to know it, he doesn't name Antifa and BLM, domestic terrorist organization. He talks about it. I think these people should be beyond arrested. They should be enemy combatants. Send them to Gitmo. I don't care if we ever see the trial. It's just getting, I mean, it sounds crazy, but it's crazy. And it's like, what are we doing about this stuff? Why aren't some of these people being handled? And by the way, you talk about the NSA or whatever. Let us remember that Russia, and maybe this was collusion, they were kind enough to tell the FBI in 2013, that was Bob Mueller, by the way, that these two Tsarnaev brothers were trouble and they were coming to do whatever, we should watch them. And the only thing that Mueller said to Louis Gohmert was, yeah, we were at the mosque 4 times, but that was part of our outreach program. So there you go. How do we deal with this? Why are these people being put away?
Ken, great. Jim, why don't you go ahead on that?
Well, I can't help but perk up with the name Bob Mueller. As I recall, he was the guy with the vendetta against Mr. LaRouche and busting up his organization, throwing people in jail. Gee, what a coincidence. It was mentioned earlier the idea that some of us would be appointed to the next Trump administration. I suppose the good news is that the likelihood that Durham would come out with some indictments against these people is at least greater than that. Although I don't think it's very great at all. I don't see, Comey and Clapper and Brennan doing purple walk anytime soon. I'd like to see it. I don't think it's going to happen. I do fear that Mr. Trump simply does not control his own administration. The mention of Vindman. The Constitution, Article 2 says the executive power of the United States is vested in a president of the United States, not vested in an agency consensus, the ways these people seem to think it is. So I hope something can be done, but I'm afraid that we're walking into a very kind of uncertain landscape with a lot of holes with punji sticks in them, and whether we can get through this or not, I think it's very how to make the machinery government. Oh, by the way, just one little footnote. Daniel, and I'm sure this was not intentional, used the word counter coup several times. And I'm sure nobody would infer from that that people on our side are thinking about some kind of a coup, because what we're talking about is the rule of law and the enforcement of the Constitution, but rather thwarting an anti-constitutional and illegal coup from the other side. And let's remember that in all this Russiagate stuff, the Steele dossier, I don't know of any Russian fingerprints really on the Steele dossier, but there are a lot of British MI6 fingerprints on that thing. And those facts have been out there literally for years and are totally ignored by the media. As Colonel Black was mentioning about the arms pipeline from Libya to Syria for Al Qaeda, Republicans were happy to milk that Benghazi thing for all it was worth, but not one of them would point out what was really going on in Benghazi, that was a transshipment point for these weapons to supply Al Qaeda. It was not a consulate, it was a CIA operation for that very purpose. So the level of disinformation from both parties is so horrendous, it's very daunting.
Great. I'd like to just add one thing on this LaRouche case and the British, because in the pamphlet produced by LaRouche PAC, written by Barbara Boyd, there are 3 cases that we take up, and each one really instigated by the British. The 9/11 Al Yamama British aerospace deal I'm not going to go into that more here, but the point is there was a letter sent, which we never got through Freedom of Information, which began the witch hunt against LaRouche. And Mueller is the common thread through all 3, from the original indictment and prosecution of LaRouche up in Boston. Then in 9/11, people may know he became the head of the FBI only, I think, a week or 2 weeks before 9/11 occurred. But when the commission was trying to investigate it, he arranged that various of the informant who had housed 2 of the hijackers in San Diego the informant was disappeared to an undisclosed location and could not be interviewed. And then he turns up again in the witch hunt against Trump. And I would just say the fact that they have to use a guy who either was putting on a very good act of being completely feeble when he finally got into the Senate, or is, that they could not come up with a new prosecutor over 32 years from the LaRouche case to the Trump witch hunt, does not indicate the strength of what we are up against. And I think what Daniel said about the youth movement and the young people, and I'm going to call on one younger person next here, we can beat these people. I mean, if you're Prince Philip and you want to exterminate 7 billion people on the planet, well, guess what? The targets for extermination vastly outnumber the people who are supposed to be running the show. So it's a question of us organizing, and it's a question of human nature. Lyndon LaRouche spoke often of the great poet Percy Bysshe Shelley about certain moments where even people themselves may not be aware. He said, like a trumpet that is not conscious of what it's saying, but it's sounding a certain note to call people to battle. And I think that the truth has enormous power in a moment like this, which is why we are holding these forums. And there are many people on who I know, and Ken, you yourself are organizers, have organizations who will be able to help us to get the word out and to defeat this. So I want to thank you, Ken, very much, and go to the next person. We have so many people.
Let me just say, Diane, I think I'd like to try to get this
Oh,
whole
Daniel,
thing repeated I'd like to get this repeated for our group, and I'll try to get you guys, if you're willing to do it, we'll find a date, I'll work out with you, and squeeze it in the upcoming, so we don't have to wait till next year.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, good. We'll follow up after. Excellent. Tristan. I'm sorry, I didn't give Dave enough notice, but there you are. Okay, good.
Howdy.
Hi.
Okay, thank you everyone for coming again.
I always appreciate our guests and the information that's given. I have roughly 2 or 3 questions or comments to throw out, and I definitely like feedback. Going on the concept of the coup against President Trump. I'd like to hear opinions. I love the amount of viewpoints from politicians to military, NSA analysts. Everyone is so as far as recent statements made by like Pelosi and AOC, Pelosi bringing back up impeachment, making that quiver arrow statement, and I'd like to hear you guys' opinions on AOC or Cortez's. I'm going to say it's a threat as far as President Trump filling the Supreme Court justice seat, where she said, I can't say it word for word, but she made the threat that apparently all options are on the table, including the number of justices. I personally am a history buff. That last time that's happened or attempted to happen, I don't think it went through, was Roosevelt in the late 30s. I'd like to hear your opinions on that statement about, it's that if Trump appoints someone, that Democrats are basically going to add more seats to the Supreme Court, so it shifts in their favor. I think that's as a threat, I think that's an attack on our republic. Yeah, I wrote one more thing down. As referring to the incident, sorry to jump back. This is from the beginning of the talk. Like when you referred to the incident with the Russian aircraft and the American aircraft, where like I said, like to think that a war or an incident that could lead to a war could come down to the skills of a single pilot. What are your opinions on if something like that were to happen? That cooler heads could prevail if it was simply an accident, an incident, that things could be talked down, or do you think escalation would be inevitable too, as feared in all-out war or World War III? Personally, I always find these things very interesting. I've seen a lot of things from Russia that shows, I'll say, friendship and not necessarily malicious behavior. Then I see stuff like that. Daniel, I'd almost want to ask, have you ever even been to the 9/11 memorial in New Jersey that was donated by Russia? Like, again, I sit there and think about something like that. Like I think I see that as something you wouldn't do without it being real. But again, like I don't see our relationships with Russia on a real standpoint deteriorating, besides political discourse playing its part. And then I also have a direct question for Colonel Black. Thank you for your service. I had family who served in Vietnam, and that war, I have a very special place for that, for those veterans in my heart. So thank you very much for your service. And as far as touching on the recent statements that you even highlighted made by military personnel, ex-military personnel, leading up to, say, coups or benevolent statements, in the event, and I'd hate to think that we'd ever come down to a true point of a full coup where a sitting president was forcibly removed by office by unlegal means or unconstitutional means. What is your viewpoint on the military action on that? I've always spoken with friends, and most of us have agreed that a situation like that would be scary, because all of us believe that there would be a fracturing within the military. Not to say that we'd see a civil war come out of it, which would be the worst incident to hit our country ever again. But as far as looking at the oath of enlistment, that my dad is a veteran. I have a lot of veterans in my family, and that the oath of enlistment is taken very seriously. They swear to uphold and defend against all threats, foreign and domestic. And what generals will preach one thing and what generals will preach another thing, that can blur the lines of duty and service, that could again, fracture the military into separate armies to stand toe to toe against each other. And that's that. Thank you.
If I could, let me just start with the last question, and I'll let you all work through the others. The question is, well, what would the military do if they were asked to overthrow the president of the United States? I doubt that it would play out in quite that way. I think there would be a false flag that would be used as a pretext to put troops out on the street. Now, at the same time, just the other day, within the last couple of days, George Soros has funneled almost $250 million into various racist groups like BLM. And that's a huge amount of money, a vast sum of money that can be used to fund and pay foot soldiers to get out and to riot and disrupt. And I think what they would hope to do is that you would have this very senior cabal of generals who would direct things, and you would have more junior people who really would be kind of insulated from what was actually going on. There was an interesting article back in 2017 in The Conversation, and it's called Thinking the Unthinkable. Could there be a military coup in the United States? And it lays out actually kind of a detailed plan for the overthrow of the American government. And it says the most critical thing for any successful plot will be to shut down all communications across the continental United States. And it laid out the method to do it. It said using the U.S. Cyber Command, we would use one of these tools that we've developed, which is a rather sinister thing. I'm not sure why we developed it, but we have software that allows us to employ a cyber attack and to make it look like some other country is doing it. So in other words, what this individual in this article is suggesting is that U.S. Cyber Command launch a cyber attack that shuts down all of the communications, perhaps the electrical grid and so forth, and blames it on China or blames it on Russia. And under that pretext, he suggests that we then take troops to the street. He says we need to tie down Manhattan, Washington, D.C., and parts of Los Angeles, which basically are the communication centers of the nation. And he actually prescribes which troop unit should do each of these. He says that we need to shut down the National Military Command Center, or we need to control it. The plotters need to control it. So there are very detailed plans, and the plans rely on managing to deceive the military about the true nature of what is taking place until it's too late. Once the military has combined with the street mobs, these racist elements that are being funded by Soros and others, by then you have this combined force of military and street mobs. And by the time that the military actually figures out what's going on, it may be too late. The government may simply have toppled. And I think that is part of the plan. It's not that the individual colonel and sergeant and private is going to turn on his country, but that they will be used by these senior generals, some of the 4-star retired generals even, to turn on the country without their knowledge, without their understanding of what's going on. So I think that is the greater danger. Trump has just said the other day, I think he put it pretty well. He said there are a lot of these generals, a lot of these retired generals who don't like me because they're in the business of selling bombs and making wars. He said people who like me are the troops, the soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines. They're the ones who come out in mass and cheer the president, and they really love him. But this article, incidentally, I mean, it goes so far as to lay out that the coup should take place on a public holiday when the president is at Mar-a-Lago. And it says that because Mar-a-Lago is on sort of a peninsula, it's very easily cut off, and it would be easy to capture the president. This thing goes into substantial detail, and I suspect that the people who are considering using military force are cognizant of the article.
Daniel, do you want to respond to the question from Tristan?
I'll say very briefly, Tristan, that well, really, Diane is the person who should be talking about this, but I'm very proud to have been a part of a now annual tradition of of honoring those victims of the including the Alexandrov ensemble, the almost entirety of the Russian chorus, the Alexandrov ensemble, which is the present day version of the Red Army chorus that dates back to World War II and prior. And this memorial that we have organized, and Diane is the leading organizer of it, has included the Schiller Institute NYC Chorus singing in honor of those victims of that crash. This is the flight that crashed on its way into Syria, and it included among its victims a leading Russian humanitarian who was going to Syria to support the people there, and the victims of the war that Colonel Black has been referring to, that has been perpetrated with support from our own government, for Al Qaeda and related groups. And so the point is that we have gone to this particular memorial that you're talking about. In fact, my friend actually owns the shipping company that brought that memorial to Bayonne, to New Jersey, and then they set it up in Bayonne. And it's a very clear indication that what you're saying is true. There's a dedication that comes from particularly Vladimir Putin, but from the Russian people generally. I know a lot of Russian Americans in the area, and the dedication is to a principle of collaboration against the evils represented by this kind of dark age terrorism that we have seen in the world, supported by the United States and British intelligence in particular. And so I think this is really absolutely critical, and therefore everyone should completely oppose the insane attacks on Russia that are clearly being perpetrated for geopolitical reasons, like the claim about Russian interference to criticize Biden that has just been made, supposedly CIA leak, the claims about the Taliban, the money for killing Americans that Diane referenced, which are turned out to be completely illegitimate, and this ridiculous setup with Navalny, who is sort of smiling proudly in his latest pictures, and no victim he. So that's what I have to say briefly.
Just so people know, that picture that Dave just put up there is the Teardrop Memorial, which was given to the United States and dedicated actually by President Putin in memory of all those who perished on 9/11. And the black section at the base has the names of the victims of that attack. And this is the ceremony where you see the captain of the Bayonne Fire Department, the New York Police Department ceremonial unit joined us in memorializing this extraordinary chorus who died on Christmas Day. And we've been holding this ceremony each year. So just to show that. Kirk, you had something. Why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, just very quickly, part of his question was about what's the likelihood an aircraft could get into Russian airspace or someone's airspace and cause World War III. My own experience, and I'm going to give you a couple of statistics. Between 1950 and 1964, the Russians shot down 13 United States reconnaissance aircraft. Either one, and these aircraft, clearly one of those was over the Soviet Union. That was the U-2, the infamous U-2 shoot down of Gary Francis Powers in 1960. But those are rare. More typically, the military will fly reconnaissance aircraft along the perimeter of Russia to test their radar capabilities, to actually cause their radars to turn on, and then for us to be able to get some sense of how good their radar defense is. 13, and none of those caused a world war. And I would argue that tensions back in that time period between the US and the Soviet Union were greater than they are today. And I also want to point out that the Russians shot down a commercial airliner on September 1st, 1983. And that would provoke a number of nations in the Far East, because that Korean Airlines Flight 007 was shot down on its way to Tokyo, and near the Aleutian Islands, the Russian MiG-25 shot 4 bursts from its 50 caliber machine gun and blew the plane out of the sky. Terrible tragedy. But again, the world didn't go to war over it. So my sense is low probability where a single aircraft is involved. Now, multiple aircraft, different kinds of scenarios could be different, but just a single aircraft would likely not.
Thank you.
Thank you. And Marussia? Are you there? Oh, you're muted.
Okay, hello, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Hello? Okay, great. I'll make my question short. I wanted to direct my question to Colonel Black. First of all, I'd like to thank all of you. This has been really very, very educational, very interesting, and a little frightening. I wanted to ask about the, we know there have been numerous assassination attempts on the president already. And my question is regarding threats of assassination. There have been some, I would say, seeds planted in the press that Iran has threatened to assassinate President Trump in retaliation for the murder of Qasem Soleimani. And I am of the opinion that what is really happening here, because I don't believe that Iran would do something so bold. I just don't think that they can do it. I just don't think they're capable of taking on the United States and going to war with us. So what I believe is going on is that the deep state is going to attempt to assassinate the president, frame Iran for it, use Qasem Soleimani as the excuse, attempt to start World War III, and while everyone is distracted with that, they're going to install their puppet president. That's just my opinion, and I wanted Colonel Black's opinion on whether he thinks that that's possible or that's feasible.
Well, I would say this. when General Soleimani was killed, he was on a diplomatic mission. There were tensions between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia invited him to meet and to discuss lessening tensions. So in a sense, he was traveling under a flag of truce, and he went and he was killed by a GPS-seeking missile. Um, the Iranians showed remarkable restraint. While they did some things by accident, the things that they did deliberately were very, very measured and very minor. The Iranians do not want war with the United States. They've done everything possible to avoid it. The purpose of killing Soleimani, from the State Department's vantage point, was to trigger a great war with Iran. Now, Iran is much bigger than Iraq, much bigger than Syria, and it would be a real bone to chew. There would be a lot of bloodshed. There would be millions of Iranians who would die, and many Americans would die. Trillions and trillions would be spent. But I think between John Bolton and Pompeo, I think the purpose of the death of Soleimani, who was a national hero in his country, the purpose was to do something that they felt would just almost certainly trigger a war. And there's no doubt that there are major elements within the State Department and the CIA intent on doing something to trigger a war. So that was the situation that occurred there. I do not see any probability that Iran would somehow try to assassinate the president. They would realize that if they were tied to that, that would mean war. That would mean they would be destroyed. However, it is not unthinkable at all that there are elements of the deep state that would assassinate the president if they thought it possible. I mean, we've seen this in the past. You know, John F. Kennedy was assassinated. We've had others. They shot Teddy Roosevelt in the chest and tried to kill him. So it's not an unusual thing. It's a very unfortunate thing. But I think it's important that President Trump use caution as he approaches Election Day, because these are the people arrayed against him are prepared to do anything in their power to somehow throw this election. They might win it anyway. I don't know. I don't know who's going to win the election, but I think there is no limit to what they would do in order to bring it about. I tell you, I personally, we're often distracted by these claims that, oh, the Iranians, the Russians, the Chinese, all these people are going to do these things. If you look at Russia, for example, which is the biggest boogeyman of all, their population is half that of the United States. Their economy is the size of Italy's. The U.S. military budget is the size of the next largest 11 countries, including China and Russia, and just on and on and on, a whole list of them. We massively are outarm the other side. And so, meanwhile, we keep running these very provocative exercises right up to the very borders of Russia. And we funnel money and arms into the Ukraine so that the Ukraine can fight against Russia and its allies. Very provocative things, and I think there are elements. I'm not sure that there's like a central organization that wants a war with Russia, but I think there are significant elements of the deep state that are very reckless, and I think they are willing to see us go to war with Russia. The thing that those people must remember is that even though Russia's half our size, even though they don't have an expansionist philosophy, even though they have a small economy, the one thing they have is they have the first or the second largest nuclear capability on Earth. We do not want to constantly stick them in the eye and risk the possibility of a nuclear war. The reason that we went through the whole Cold War without one of these aircraft shoot downs triggering combat is that both sides recognize the horrific gravity of a nuclear war between the two superpowers. And we've forgotten it. New generations have come along, they've forgotten Hiroshima, Nagasaki, they've forgotten the whole tension and so forth, and they're willing to play reckless with the possibility of a nuclear war that could exterminate 2/3 of all humanity. And so they had better wake up. But back to your question about the possibility of an assassination, Trump needs to be very careful. He needs to really be watchful at this point, because there are people quite willing to do that if they can carry it out.
Great. Thank you, Marusi. I think we need to.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. We need to wrap up, and I would just like to ask our guests if they have closing thoughts or comments, and perhaps Senator Black, will start with you. You just answered if there's anything you wish to add.
I just, my goal right at this present time is to shine the spotlight on this potential coup. I have no question in my mind that this is at least a plan B that the Democrats and the generals and the deep state have. But as we shine light on it, the more implausible it becomes. Hopefully, a couple of years from now, people will look back on this discussion and say, "Oh, well, that was rubbish. That foolish speculation." That I would be quite happy if that's the case, because I think we need to talk about it. We need to quote the exact words by these people, like James Mattis, and say this is very dangerous. So that's what I'm about, trying to shine the light on this.
Great, thank you so much. Kirk Wiebe? Oh, unmute yourself. You're muted.
I'm sorry.
There we go.
If there was one idea, one thought I'd like to leave with the viewers, it's that for too long, we've been spoiled in this country. We have become watchers and not doers. And I would urge everyone watching to urge their friends to take some personal responsibility to make a difference. Now, normally we think, well, that means voting for the right candidate in an election. Yeah, that's helpful. But Colonel Black and all of us are painting a picture of potential chaos, the kind of which we have never seen before. And no one knows exactly how it will go, how much hubris people will show, how much stupidity will play out. You can count on a real mix. And then it's just a matter of scale. Do things really get out of hand? Is there twice as much? I don't know. Picking up the telephone and calling a senator, a representative, someone in Washington and voice your thoughts. Don't just be a watcher. Be a participant. You know, Thomas Jefferson wrote, and I'm going to quote, "The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. It is its natural manure." In other words, source of food. This may involve people at the grassroots level weighing in some meaningful way. Don't know what that'll play out to be. I hope it's just phone calls is all that's necessary. But please don't be a watcher as things begin to get chaotic. Communicate and demand the Constitution be followed by everyone in Washington.
Thank you. Jim?
Let me pick up briefly on both of those two thoughts. I was struck when Senator Black said Plan B, because I was thinking in those exact same terms. Plan A is win or steal the election. If that doesn't work, Plan B is the coup. And if that doesn't work, Plan C is the one Maruzia raised in her question, which is to remove Trump with extreme prejudice. And all of those are on the table. And, you know, I hear a lot of hand wringing of people saying, oh, can't we all be nice? Can't we learn to see the good in the other side and all hold hands and sing Kumbaya and all that stuff? I wish it were not so, but I think we're past that. I think that in terms of, you know, somebody pointed out with regard to our second Civil War, if you count the Revolution and the Patriots versus Loyalists, but our previous Civil War, that they prayed to the same God. They had the same basic moral view of the universe in many respects, but they differed over the political arrangements of our country. That's not true anymore, that the differences between Americans are existential now. We don't pray to the same God if we pray to God at all. We don't have the same moral foundation about what is a human being, what is human life, what are our duties to one another as people. I don't know how a country overcomes those divisions. I think it simply boils down at some point, somebody wins and somebody loses. And I don't know how that plays out. I suspect and I fear that that goes beyond normal politics, that since the other side is playing for keeps, this is for all the marbles, and is ruthlessly willing to use whatever means necessary. And we've heard that phrase from the other side, that that's a challenge to what I might call just regular Americans to see the responsibilities of citizenship, of being a human being, of being a father, a mother, a grandfather, a grandmother, in the most dire terms, because that weight of responsibility is on our brow, and we cannot avoid it.
Great, thanks. Daniel?
I think I just want to say thank you to the people who participated tonight and communicate that I'm devoted to following through on everything that we discussed. Thank you.
Great. And I have a couple of things to say, of course. One is people may have heard, it just came out, I think it was the BBC, that someone got this tranche of 2,500 pages worth of suspicious activity reports of the banks, SAR, and it shows that these banks were laundering trillions of dollars of drug money, probably human trafficking, gun running, and they set up over 3,000 fake fronts where they did these businesses. Now, I'm saying this because the people have too much respect for things that they are told to respect by the media, like money, which people consider to have power, or control of the media, which people consider to have power, except no one watches it anymore. And I think that this can easily be shattered. This is why LaRouche was so feared when his 4 laws, the first of which is the reinstatement of the Glass-Steagall Act, would completely bankrupt this speculative crap, which is the way that these people are funding the things. In other words, they are holding themselves up as high and mighty and powerful, and everything they do is a fraud. They can only succeed by criminality, and that means they can only succeed if the American people allow them to succeed. And I don't think that's different than what anyone said here, because all of us agree that it's very urgent that people be active. And I would like to stress again, the conference this Saturday, which is a conference organized by younger people with younger people speaking, but everybody should watch it. It starts at 10 a.m. on Sunday on the Schiller Institute. Very important. People should plan to watch that. The first panel is on the exoneration of LaRouche. The second panel is young people discussing what the world would be like had Lyndon LaRouche been allowed to be president. And I would like to say on that he stressed over and over and over again in his later years the question of forecasting. He said, we have to forecast. You have to be able to forecast. Now, he was the best forecaster on the planet. But I think there's 2 parts to that. One is you have to be, where do you get the strength to fight? Part of it is you have to carry in your gut the consequences of not acting. So if you're scared, if the image of what horror potentially can befall us is unpleasant, good. Keep that as a source of strength when you feel fatigued, when you feel like you don't want to talk to one single more person, that you draw on that to compel yourself to fight to reach the next person, because it may be that person who actually transforms the situation. The other type of forecast, which is what we'll be presenting, the young people will present on Sunday afternoon, is what does victory look like? You can't win a war if you don't have a conception of what is the peace. And it's been my conviction that for far too long, Americans have tolerated conditions which are completely insane. And perhaps this is one reason why they don't want anyone to know what's actually going on in China, where they build 1,000-bed hospitals in 2 weeks, or 57-story buildings in 1 week. Or we spent 10 years building the 2nd Avenue subway. We spent 34 years building the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway. Americans are paying tens of thousands of dollars on tolls and transportation fees on highways that are filled with potholes. We have been tolerating conditions which we have no business tolerating and which can actually be turned around very, very quickly. It doesn't have to continue forever. And I think that's part of the threat that is feared from President Trump, especially as he addresses this question of culture, which is key to this. So I think there's a certain happiness in waging a war where you know that failure is not an option. This is a war that we cannot afford to lose. And in that sense, it actually makes me think of the Ruttli Oath from Friedrich Schiller's play Wilhelm Tell, where people say that we understand there's a principle of natural law, that there's a limit to a tyrant's power, and we are going to combine to ensure that this tyrant, namely the British Empire, is defeated, as Lyndon LaRouche said. So I would like to close there. Please participate in the conference this Saturday. Please visit the site larouchepack.com. There are daily briefings given by Harley Schlanger. There's breaking new papers on the website and new documentation. And I would really like to very much thank all of you for being with me this evening in my campaign, and I appreciate your courage and your patriotism, and we will not allow our country to be defeated.
Hear, hear.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.